David Cole never needed a medal to prove he was a soldier. Years in uniform had sharpened his instincts, but nothing hit harder than the silence of his son, Ben, on the walk to school. It wasn't just quiet. It was a kind of empty space, heavy with things left unsaid. When David slipped a recorder into Ben's pocket, he thought he was protecting him. But the first thing he heard, shrill laughter, mean words, told him this was a fight he'd never been trained for. It was early fall in a small town, the sky draped in a thin, worn light, like an old sheet laid over the yellowing oaks. Not bright, just enough to slip through the haze and touch the faded tin roofs, the gravel roads still damp from the night. Sparrows gathered under the eaves, moving slow from branch to branch, like nothing out there was in any hurry. In the narrow kitchen, David leaned against the wooden counter, hands around a white mug still steaming. The heat worked its way into calloused fingers, the kind shaped by years of carrying a rifle and doing hard work. The smell of coffee hung with the old wood scent of the cabinets, and yesterday's paper sat folded on the table. Through the window, sunlight filtered through the blinds, cutting long stripes across the gray tile floor, like the quiet footprints of the morning. Ben sat across from him in a wooden chair, back straight, shoulders drawn in just a little. 8 years old, brown hair tousled, he was quietly tugging the zipper of his worn blue jacket, the cuffs frayed from use. Every move was slow, almost careful, like he didn't want to disturb the air. No cheerful good mornings, no chatter to fill the space, just the sound of a spoon brushing against a cup, the faint groan of floorboards when he shifted his feet. David took a sip of coffee, letting the bitterness sit on his tongue. He studied his son, small hands clutching the zipper, breath fogging lightly in the cool air. Something in a moment made his chest loosen a little. A quiet kind of warmth, like just having been there was enough to start the day. But it was a fragile thing, and David knew it, worth keeping only if he could guard it. Outside, a neighbor's pickup rumbled to life, the low engine reminding him the town was waking up. David set the mug down with a soft clink and walked to the coat hooks, pulling down a pair of gray wool gloves. He knelt slightly, looping a scarf around Ben's neck. His fingers brushed the back of his son's neck through the knit, gentle but with an edge, like a silent vow. Ben kept his head down, letting his dad fix the scarf. In the angled light from the window, his face was half in shadow. David realized it had been a long time, since coming back from his last deployment, that he'd had a morning like this, just sitting with his boy. And the thought came sharp, hold on to it. The warmth, the peace. Keep it from anything that could take it away. When Ben stepped out onto the porch, the floor creaked again. The door opened, letting in the cool air, carrying the smell of the first fallen leaves. David stood in the doorway, hand on the frame, watching each small step across the yard. Ben's shadow stretched long across the patchy grass, shrinking as he reached the white fence. And in that moment, David knew he didn't have much left in this life. But for the one thing he did have, that boy walking away each morning. He wouldn't back down, like the old days in the service, when you couldn't turn away from the post you were given. Only now, it wasn't about orders. It was about a small heart out there that still believed in him. He closed the door, the latch falling into place with a clean sound. Back in the kitchen, he picked up the now cool coffee and drank, like sealing a promise. In the morning light, his shoulders sat a little straighter, his steps a little firmer. This wasn't just another day. It was the start of commitment. Whatever came, he'd be here, holding the line, to protect a moment that might look small, but held his whole world. The porch steps were still wet with dew, tiny drops clinging to the weathered boards. David knelt to adjust the scarf again. The gray knit had been with Ben since last winter, edges a bit frayed, carrying the familiar mix of laundry soap and the faint warmth that still belonged to his son. David's fingers moved slow along the scarf's knit, brushing the soft hair at the back of his boy's neck. It was a feeling close and warm, but so fragile it seemed like it could slip away if he held it too tight. Ben didn't look up. His eyes stayed fixed on the foggy yard. He stood still, shoulders drawn in, like a kid trying to make himself smaller against the world. David kept his hands steady, careful not to let haste push them further apart. The scarf went neatly around the boy's neck. When he tugged the end to straighten it, Ben tilted his head slightly, not to help, but like instinct telling him to turn toward a safer corner. Away from gaze, David caught it, and instead of asking, just bent lower, focusing on the knot, giving the kid space to breathe. The door groaned low as it opened. Cold, clean air pushed in, carrying the smell of wet leaves and damp soil in early fall. Ben stepped down the porch steps, his gray-blue sneakers tapping against the boards, sharp, quick sounds that vanished into the quiet street. David stayed in the doorway, one hand on the frame, watching. His breath came out in faint clouds, mixing with the morning haze. Ben's shadow stretched long over the patchy grass, then shortened as he neared the white fence. The paint had been peeling for years, a few boards leaning to one side, but it still stood like a line between their home and the rest of the world. The boy didn't turn back, just slipped onto the worn path toward the main road. When that small figure disappeared behind the fence, David's eyes stayed fixed, like maybe watching a little longer could keep him here. He knew it was just something you tell yourself. He closed the door. The latch dropped into place with a sound that, in his chest, felt like a lock tightening on the thin line between father and son. Each day, that line felt thinner, not because the love was less, but because empty spaces had started to creep in, quiet and unnamed. He leaned against the door for a while, listening to the town wake up, the bakery truck rumbling past, the neighbor's dog barking. To anyone else, it was just a normal morning. But to him, there was a weight, distance you couldn't measure in feet. Only in the longer silences, the fewer words, the way a goodbye at the door had grown as light as a passing breeze. In the kitchen, he picked up the coffee that had gone cold. The bitter taste slid down, dry in his throat. On the table, the wall calendar showed today, faintly marked in pencil, a habit from his army days. Back then, marking days meant tracking progress. Now, those marks reminded him how much of their time was filled with things that didn't belong to them. School, strangers, maybe even things Ben wouldn't or couldn't say. By now, the boy was probably on the bus. David pictured him pressed against the window, backpack on his lap, eyes on nothing in particular. He'd been that age once, when you get pulled into things you don't understand, just knowing you don't belong anywhere. And if no one catches it, that feeling settles deep. He set the cup down and stood straighter. That unseen distance wasn't something he was ready to live with. It felt like a cable drawn tight, one hard pull, and it would snap. And when it did, there'd be no putting it back the way it was. He knew that much from losses he'd already lived through. His hand went to Ben's knit cap hanging on the hook, fingers pressing the soft lining. This morning, he'd only wrapped a scarf. Soon, he'd have to do more, not just to keep the kid warm, but to find out what was pulling him away. The fragile lift he felt each time Ben walked out the door wouldn't last if he couldn't protect it. And in that growing space between them, David felt something taking shape. A resolve to push back at whatever was trying to pull his son out of reach. He turned once more toward the window, where the morning light was already fading. The peace in this little town looked like a picture worth keeping, but he knew it only stays that way if someone's willing to stand between it and the hands that could break it. And him, tired as he was from too many battles, he wasn't about to let this one go. Not for orders. For a boy who'd vanished behind a white fence, and a line he swore he'd hold on to, no matter what it took. By mid-autumn, the days were already closing in. The amber light outside the kitchen window was fading into shadows when Ben came through the door. It shut softly, but the old hinge gave a faint, dry squeak David could hear from the sink. On the sleeve of his blue jacket, a patch of dried mud ran dark from the elbow down to the hem of his pants. Around his left wrist, the skin was scraped raw, ringed by pale skin. David stopped mid-rinse, hands still under the water. He didn't say anything right away, just glanced over, then reached for the towel. Ben bent to take off his shoes, moving quick but quiet, like he didn't want to draw attention. His white socks were yellowed at the toes, the heels worn thin. They ate late. David had just gotten back from the shop. Supper was simple. Beef stew with potatoes, sliced bread, a side of vegetables gone cool. Ben sat across from him, back straight, eyes down. Each time he lifted the spoon, he bit his lower lip for a second, like weighing something in his head, then swallowed it down with the food. David tried to cut through the quiet with an easy question. How was school? His voice was even, not pushing. Ben paused, gave a small nod. Nothing more. Tired? Another simple one. This time the boy shook his head. That was it. David didn't press. He tore a piece of bread, dipped it in the cold stew broth, let the time pass with the sound of cutlery on plates. In the army, he'd learned to read more from the way someone stayed quiet than from what they said. And Ben's silence wasn't the kind of daydreaming you see in kids. It was watchful. Like any answer might bring trouble he didn't want to face. When they finished, Ben carried his dishes to the sink, stood on a plastic stool to reach the faucet. From behind, David caught the scrape on his wrist as the sleeve rode up. He watched the red mark, then the water swirling food scraps and soap away. The rest of the evening, Ben stayed in his room, only opening the door to get a glass of water. David sat in the living room, lamplight falling on the paper in his lap, though he wasn't reading. The only sound were the tick of the clock and the wind slipping through the doorframe. Before turning in, David stopped by Ben's room. The door was ajar, the nightlight casting a soft yellow glow inside. Ben sat at his desk, back to the door, writing in a notebook. His backpack sat neatly by the chair, one strap crusted with dried mud. Rough in the light, David didn't step in. He stood there a moment, then went to his own room. On the way, the image of the scraped wrist and the dark mud stayed with him. Not the kind you get from playing outside, but the kind that sits in damp, forgotten corners. He hung his jacket on the hook, the weight in his chest heavier than when he'd walked in. He'd marched through streets thick with mud and blood before, but rarely had he felt as helpless as he did now, seeing marks on his only son and not having a name for what caused them. Outside, the wind shifted, tapping at the window. David sat on the edge of his bed, head in his hands. He could push, demand answers right now, but losing people he loved had taught him that sometimes pressing too hard only drives them further away. And with Ben, he couldn't risk that. Still, something was taking shape inside him. Those stains and small injuries weren't just kid accidents to brush off. The comfort of seeing his boy safe each night wouldn't last if he didn't find a way to keep it that way. And in the soft spill of the nightlight from Ben's room, David felt the line between them was still there, but it needed his grip to keep from slipping. The town was deep in its autumn quiet now, just the wind moving through the oak branches and the faint creak of wood in the house frame. In the narrow laundry room, off the kitchen, the weak yellow glow of a fluorescent bulb fell over a stack of clean clothes. David stood there, folding each of Ben's shirts in turn. The smell of fresh laundry mixed with soap and the slight warmth left from the dryer made the space feel like a small pocket of safety, cut off from everything outside. He picked up a thin blue sweater, one Ben wore under his jacket in cold weather. As he spread it out on the folding table, his eyes caught on the collar. Right at the edge, a few threads had come loose, twisted and frayed, like someone had grabbed and yanked it hard. The stitching that used to hold firm was uneven now, stretched in places, pulled apart in others, showing the fabric underneath. David held the sweater closer, turning it under the light. There was no obvious stain on the collar, but the frayed yarn and the way the stitching pulled tight told him it had been under some kind of strain. He set his finger against it, rubbing lightly, a small gesture that carried 100 unspoken questions. No sigh, no muttered thought. He just lowered his head, smoothed the fabric with his other hand, and folded it with care. The motion was slow, precise, like the way he'd been trained in the service to pack his gear. Everything neat, squared away, even when you knew something inside wasn't right. He placed the sweater on the folded stack, squared up the edges. His fingers lingered on the fabric before pulling back. The light above stayed steady, but in his mind the scrape on Ben's wrist, the dried mud on his pant leg, and now the pull collar were starting to line up, scattered pieces coming together into the outline of a quiet worry. He shut off the laundry room light and stepped into the living room. The house settled into that soft kind of dark that wasn't quite comfortable. On the coffee table sat a book he hadn't picked up in weeks, the bookmark holding its place. He didn't touch it. Instead, he stood at the window, looking out at a still street. The glow of a few street lamps bleeding into the mist that was beginning to settle on car roofs. In that quiet, his mind went to Ben, not the boy laughing in summer sun or running barefoot in the yard like years ago, but the boy at the dinner table tonight, head down, hands hidden in his lap, eyes dodging his. The change hadn't been loud, hadn't happened overnight, but a father who paid attention would see it. And for David, even a loose thread on a collar felt like a marker for something larger, unnamed, but taking up space in his head. He climbed the stairs and stopped at Ben's door. A thin stripe of night light spilled into the hallway. Inside, the small fan hummed steady. David didn't knock. He stood still, listening to his boy's breathing, slow, even the kind that only came when sleep finally let you loosen up. He didn't want to break that, so after a while, he turned away. In his own room, David sat on the edge of the bed, elbows resting on his knees. He tried to fit the signs together, the scrape, the mud, the quiet, the sidelong glances. The collar pulled out of shape, each piece like coordinates he used to get in the army. Worthless alone, but together they could map something. And where this map led, he wasn't sure yet. Before switching off the light, his eyes went to the small wooden table by the bed. In a worn frame sat a photo of him and Ben when the boy was 5, taken just after David's discharge. Because the space between knowing and acting could decide everything, especially when what you're protecting is your own son. That night, the wind came down from the north, finding its way through the seams of the old wooden window frame. The oak leaves outside scraped and whispered, now and then a dry branch dropping onto the tin roof with a lonely clatter. David lay on his side, eyes open, staring at the dim patch of ceiling. The room was faintly lit by the street lamp outside, its glow leaking through the thin curtains and casting long shadows along the wall. The clock ticked steady, not fast, not slow, but tonight each beat felt like a knock against his temple. He shifted, looking for comfort, but his head wouldn't settle. Every image from the past few days, the scraped wrist, the mud on the cuffs, the averted eyes, the pulled collar, came back jumbled, but tied together by some thread he couldn't quite name. His hand reached to the empty side of the bed, Sarah's side. The blanket was still neatly folded, a habit he'd kept since living alone. His fingers found a familiar notch in the wood by the bed frame. He leaned forward, reached underneath, and pulled out a small wooden box. The box was dark and worn, its surface nicked in places, scars from miles traveled, from years in places where light weight and toughness mattered more than looks. The lock was rusted, but the lid still opened smooth, as if it knew its owner didn't want to wake the whole house. Inside were pieces of David's life in uniform. A scratched field compass, a small folding knife, a few stamped metal tags. With that worn-in feel, like the first time he'd held a rifle grip on training day. For David, it wasn't just about the touch. It was the way it pulled him back into a certain state of mind, ready to watch, to listen, to act. He lifted it, turned it under the dim light. The edges were still sharp, the small side buttoned smooth under his thumb. He remembered it from a special op, used to capture conversations in a dangerous zone, where a single voice could be the proof you needed to stay alive. Hoped things would right themselves. But the signs kept showing up, and the space between him and Ben wasn't closing, it was growing. His hand closed around the recorder, the cold weight pressing into his fingers. He took a slow breath. In the dark, his eyes tightened, like they'd settled on a target. The chill in the metal didn't make him pull away. It stirred a resolve he hadn't felt in years. If this was the only way to know what was going on, he'd do it. No hesitation. He set the recorder on the nightstand, beside Sarah's picture. His eyes lingered on her smile, then shifted toward the quiet shadow of Ben's door. Nights like this, he knew, wouldn't be rare. But as long as he held onto one thought, protect Ben at all costs, every sleepless night would just be part of a fight he was willing to take on. The wind slipped through the window again, rattling the curtain. In his palm, the recorder's cold, now, felt more like a reminder, enough watching from the sidelines. Tonight, he'd sit awake with a plan, and, in the morning, he picked up the hat, ran a finger along the soft lining, finding the spot just above the left ear, where a voice and the sound around Ben would come through clear. He threaded the needle with gray to match the knit, knotting it small and tight. His hands moved slow and steady, the same way he used to patch frayed straps or torn uniforms in the barracks at night. The recorder fit snug against the fabric, hidden well enough that no one would notice unless they already knew. He passed the needle through each stitch, pulling the thread just tight enough to hold without warping the shape. Now, and then he stopped, turned the cap in the weak light coming through the window, checking every seam. It wasn't just careful work. It was his way of keeping his intent slow, making sure it came from steady resolve, not a flash of impatience. When it was done, he pressed lightly around it to make sure nothing rattled or poked through. From the outside, it looked like any other winter hat in an 8-year-old's closet. He sat on the table and looked at it for a long while. In the still kitchen, the only sounds were the clock's even tick and the slow drip from the sink. Ben came down the stairs slow, still half asleep, his hair sticking up in loose clumps. He wore a blue sweater, worn-in jeans, thick socks dragging across the wood floor. David poured milk into a glass and set it in front of him. No pushing, no small talk. Just another morning, same as 100 before. When Ben finished and started looking for his gloves, David picked up the cap and stepped closer. "Keep your head warm," he said, voice even easy, just part of the routine. Nothing in his tone, or eyes gave away that under that knit was a second set of ears, ready to follow Ben through his day. He pulled the hat down over his boy's forehead, adjusting it to cover his ears. His hand rested there for a moment, like pressing in a little more warmth before sending him out into the cold. Ben gave a small nod, bent to put on his shoes. David stepped back, watching, making sure it all looked natural, so he wouldn't disturb the thin layer of peace still left. Outside, the fog hadn't lifted, beads of water clinging to the white fence and each blade of grass. When Ben stepped out, the gray cap shadowed half his face, his figure fading into the light mist. Fingers brushing the pocket where his phone sat, the one with the app tied to the recorder. The cold metal from last night had turned into a steadier feeling now, like sliding a magazine in a place before heading out. He knew what he might hear could change everything, but it was the only way to protect what was left of mornings like this. In the kitchen, Ben's glass still held a faint print of his lips, the milk already taking on the chill of the room. David stood for a while, eyes fixed on a strip of light across the floor, then sat back at the table. Outside, the screen door rattled softly in the wind, the clock ticking steady, counting down to when he'd hear what he needed to know. That afternoon, the sky hung heavy and gray, clouds sagging like they were ready to let go a light rain. The town lay under a faded kind of light, the kind that made the day feel like it was slipping away without saying goodbye. In the small kitchen, David sat alone at the table by the window. Next to his cold coffee was the phone, still linked to the recorder hidden in Ben's cap. He drew a slow breath, touched the screen, and opened the morning's file. A short beep, then a stretch of quiet, just the wind moving through the mic. The rustle of fabric when Ben shifted. David brought the phone closer to his ear. The sound grew clearer. Wind cutting past trees, the squeak of the playground's metal gate closing. Underneath it, children's voices, loud, careless, broken up by high-pitched laughter. To some, it might have sounded like the soundtrack of a childhood. But to David, it came with another color, too bright a backdrop meant to hide the darker corners. Then a boy's voice cut in, drawn out like he wanted it to carry. "Here's the big mouth again." A burst of laughter followed, then another voice. "Don't let him play. He's too slow." David sat up straighter, fingers going still on the table. That old muscle tension crept in, the kind you get before things break loose, even though he was sitting safe in his own kitchen. The recording went on. The sound of small feet hitting pavement. A ball bouncing off concrete. Another voice, higher, younger, spoke up. "Nobody wants to play with you, old turtle." Laughter followed, short and sharp, like small stones hitting thin glass. Through it all, Ben's voice never came. Just short breaths, folding into the wind. David closed his eyes for a beat. He'd heard worse, from grown men, intense negotiations, or inside holding cells. But hearing this, aimed at an 8-year-old wearing the cap he'd stitched last night, cut deeper. Then the sound shifted, footsteps on gravel, dry leaves crunching. A voice, louder now, with a tone that left no room. "Go somewhere else. You're in the way." A pause, then Ben's shoes moving off. The sound growing faint. Wind rushed harder into the mic, followed by the slam of a metal gate. David opened his eyes, looked out the window. The backyard sat empty, just a few folded chairs and a wooden table on the porch. Everything was still, a sharp contrast to the world he'd just heard through the ears of that device. The recording kept going, and Ben's voice was still nowhere. Just the sound of fabric brushing against his jacket pocket, then something like a plastic bag stretching. In the background, a few other voices carried from a distance. No names now, just laughter and the thud of a ball. The kind of noise that, to most people, meant recess. But to David, it felt like a wall keeping him from reaching his own kid. He stopped the recording and set the phone on the table. His fingers rested on the rim of his coffee cup, but he didn't drink. The cold from the ceramic seeped into his hand, a quiet reminder of how long it had been since he'd poured it. David leaned back in his chair, staring into nothing. In his head, the sounds he just heard kept circling, especially the empty spaces. The spaces where Ben didn't speak, didn't push back, just let himself be edged out. He knew that kind of silence. It wasn't peace. It was a sign. In the service, David had learned to read the gaps between signals, to hear what wasn't being said. And Ben's silence, tucked between laughter and taunts, was the loudest warning of all. He picked the phone back up, replayed a few sections. Each time, he paid closer attention to the breathing, to how the wind hit the mic when Ben moved. Small things, the slower steps after a cutting remark, the rustle of plastic as he busied himself with something alone, all pieced together into a clearer picture of his boy's world in those hours away from home. Outside, clouds were bunching up, the wind pressing against the house hard enough to stir the curtains. David stayed there, his hand tightening on the phone. He didn't know everything he'd hear in the hours still left on the recording, but this part alone was enough to fan an old ember into a steady flame. He wasn't going to sit on the sidelines anymore. He knew, if you want to keep your kid's smile, to hold on to whatever piece is left, you sometimes have to step into the coldest wind. And what he'd just heard, not loud, not sharp, but with that chill that makes you feel like you've done something wrong before you even know what it is. "Ben, sweep the yard," she said. "No, please." No light touch on the shoulder. Just a bare command, delivered from just far enough away to underline authority. David knew that voice. Mrs. Carter, Ben's homeroom teacher. At parent conferences, "Take the trash out when you're done," Mrs. Carter added, her tone unchanged. David heard the crinkle of a garbage bag, a long pull of wine through the mic, then Ben's voice, "Yes, ma'am." So soft that if the mic hadn't been right by his ear, David might have missed it. That wasn't shyness. That was the sound of a kid trying to disappear, loud enough to prove he'd answered, quiet enough not to stand out. David's knuckles tightened on the table. The wooden chair beside him creaked as he unconsciously pushed it away a little, like he needed more room to breathe. He'd heard that tone before, in other places, other times boot camp, among people who thought rank gave them the right to say anything. But that was the Army. This was a school. The recording rolled on. The broom scratched across damp gravel, a sound coarse and steady, like rough cloth dragged over the earth. Every scrape seemed to wear at him. Somewhere farther off, children's laughter rang out, bright, crisp, and untouched by whatever shadow hung over Ben. Once in a while, a shout to pass the ball cut the air, sharp and fleeting. None of it was meant for him. David could see it as if he were standing at the edge of that playground. A winter sky the color of tin, the kind that held back snow but gave no warmth. The last brittle leaves turned in the wind. The wound went a little deeper. He wondered how long this had been the shape of his son's days. A week? A month? Longer? And why, in the one slice of the day meant for running free, was a child doing the work of keeping the grounds clean, visible to the whole yard? What lesson was being carved into him, stroke by stroke under the open sky? The scrape of the broom softened. The rustle of the trash bag, full now, dragged on the gravel. David sat with his elbows on the table, the kitchen light pooling in front of him, listening as the recording sank into a quieter register. It wasn't the calm of night he heard in that silence. It was the still air before storm arrives. His hands, both of them, pressed flat to the tabletop, the way he might press them against the cold metal of a Humvee hood in some far-off desert. He knew this stillness. It was the moment before you make your move. Then a sound, a door opening. Not the light, swinging sound of a classroom door, but something heavier, deeper inside the building. Maybe a storage room. Then nothing. The track ended. He looked up from the phone, out the kitchen window. In the yard, the oak branches swayed and bent in the wind, the bark silvered by late light. His reflection in the glass was faint, overlaid with that restless motion. He knew then, whatever came next, he would never see Mrs. Carter the same way again. The cord between him and Ben had just pulled tighter, stronger in its bond, sharper in its edge. The next morning, David stood in the school's empty hallway, hands sunk deep in the pockets of his coat. Beyond a frosted glass pane, yellow light fell in soft patches on a floor of pale tile. The air was faintly warm, but still carried the draft slipping in from under the door. A bulletin board leaned slightly crooked on the wall, a corner of colored paper curling toward him. He could hear the slow, deliberate ticks of a wall clock inside, each one drawn out like a pause before a word you don't want to hear. 3 knocks, then a measured come in. Inside, the smell hit him first, chalk dust, and the faint tang of varnished wood from the file cabinets lining the wall. On the desk, steam rose from a cup of tea, set neatly beside a stack of student folders. Mrs. Carter sat behind it all, posture straight, her smile wide enough to pass for warmth, but with a distance in her eyes, a film that didn't lift. "Mr. Cole, please sit," she said, as if greeting any parent. He lowered himself into the wooden chair, its chill reaching him through the fabric of his jacket. For a moment, He let his gaze rest on the worn carpet, a few loose threads at his feet. When he looked up, it was slow, deliberate. "I want to know," he said, voice level, "why my son comes home with mud on his clothes, scrapes on his wrists, and why he's out sweeping the yard alone during recess." Her pen made a soft click as she set it down. She folded her hands, smile still in place, head tipped as though explaining something to a student who had missed the point. "Mr. Cole, Ben's a bright boy, but he lacks focus. I've found that small tasks, like sweeping, can help instill discipline. It's nothing serious." The words landed without weight in the air between them. David didn't speak. His eyes narrowed, not with visible anger, but to steady the surge rising inside. The sounds from yesterday's recording threaded through his head. The broom scrape, the soft drag of small shoes. The nearly inaudible, "Yes, ma'am." "Nothing serious?" The question came low, almost an echo. She gave a small shrug, a movement so practiced it almost blended into her breath. "We prepare children here for the real world, and the real world isn't always gentle." His gaze slid to the corner, where a plant sat in a chipped pot, its leaves folded in on themselves from thirst. Her words looped in his head, tangled with the image of Ben standing apart, head lowered, the games passing him by. He could have told her everything, the recording, the laughter, the way a boy's joy was being shaved down day after day. But he didn't. A single nod. "Thanks for explaining." Her smile deepened, as though the meeting had gone just as it should. "We always want what's best for the children." He stepped back into the hallway. The door clicked shut. The chalk smell clung faintly to his jacket, but inside, the cold had given way to something denser, heavier, something that was already beginning to take form. Outside, the yard lay still. A dry leaf skittered along the pavement. Then walked on, neither hurried nor slow, carrying in his chest a plan that didn't yet have a name, but already had a weight. When he'd stood at Mrs. Carter's desk, the space between them had felt smaller than the size of the room. Pressed in, weighted by a silence he couldn't measure in feet or inches. The same yellow light spilled from the overhead fixture. But whatever warmth it had held when he entered had drained away. It fell across the desk in a flat sheet, catching on a silver pen laid diagonally atop the topmost folder, as though it were a ruler separating one truth from another. When David mentioned Ben being kept outside during recess, her smile flickered, just for the length of a blink, but to him it was as clear and sharp as the red flare of a warning round in the night. She reached for the stack of papers, tapped them into place, flipped one over as if to signal the conversation was moving on, then spoke in that steady, practiced tone. "I'll look into it." The pause between "I'll" and "look into it" felt deliberate, like she'd scanned her vocabulary for something softer, more human, and come up empty, settling instead on the most distant, least committal phrase within reach. No apology, no recognition, only a polite stone wall. David didn't bother to fill the silence. He nodded slowly, but what he understood wasn't in her words. It was in the gap between them, the kind of invisible space where kids like Ben get left standing alone. His right hand stayed buried deep in his coat pocket, thumb brushing the lining, the way a soldier might check that a lucky coin or a keepsake was still there. Leaving her office, his shoes struck the tile in slow, deliberate beats, each one part of a count that led away from her and whatever answers she'd chosen not to give. He didn't slam the door behind him, but he didn't ease it shut either. The latch caught with a small, final click. It sounded less like a conversation ending than a road closing. The hallway stretched ahead, carrying the faint scent of floor wax and the mustiness of old paperbacks stacked somewhere unseen. Down the corridor, he could hear the droning chorus of children reading aloud, their voices flat and even like they'd been pressed into the same mold. He passed the Students of the Month board without breaking stride, but his eyes flicked across it anyway. Ben's picture wasn't there, no surprise, but it still snagged something inside him. Outside, the sun had slanted low, its pale stripes falling through the branches and stretching across the empty yard. He stopped at the top of the steps, looking at the open space where he knew Ben had been to sweep gravel and leaves instead of chasing a ball or laughing with friends. Now it was just wind and a scatter of yellow leaves skittering along the ground, searching for somewhere to rest. He rubbed his chin, the weight in his chest shifting, part helplessness, part something harder, taking on edges. He knew Mrs. Carter wasn't going to hand him the truth, not straight, maybe not at all. Stepping down, he pulled his coat tighter, not to keep out the cold, but to contain what was building under his ribs, the push to see with his own eyes what others wanted hidden. He passed through the school gate, its blue paint flaking away in rust, like the husk of old stories no one wanted to read aloud. By the time he was halfway home, her, "I'll look into it," had already lost whatever weight it had tried to carry. He filed it in a mental drawer for words that meant nothing. What stayed was the image of Ben, head low, voice so small it seemed to hope no one could hear his "yes, ma'am." David knew then, some truths would never come from the people meant to guard them. His fingers flexed inside his pocket, and he picked up his pace. The early afternoon rain had left the world rinsed but dull, the pavement wet enough to shine under the broken yellow glow of a supermarket sign. David pushed a cart across the parking lot, its wheels hissing over the slick asphalt, leaving faint twin trails behind. He wasn't rushing. There was no one home yet, but Ben, still at school. The lot hummed with low sounds, rainwater dripping from gutters, car doors shutting, engines turning over. His eyes drifted over the rows of vehicles, searching without thinking for the gray pickup. Then a voice, soft, uncertain, cut through. "David." He turned. Harper Lane stood under the brim of a beige rain hood, stepping out from between two SUVs. She carried a paper grocery bag against her side, her rain jacket peppered dark with wet spots. He knew her only from a handful of PDA meetings. "Harper," he said, giving a short nod, one hand still on the cart. "Shopping for dinner too?" She smiled briefly, but her gaze swept the lot, measuring the space around them. Then she stepped closer. "Can I tell you something?" David eased the cart out of the main path, tucking them in beside a sedan. "What is it?" She hugged the paper bag tighter. "My son, last week, he was made to stand outside through the entire lunch recess. No, just because he dropped a pencil in the hallway." The damp wind moved between them, carrying the metallic scent of rain off the blacktop. David felt the tightening in his chest, not surprise, but the recognition of a pattern he already knew too well from a recording he couldn't stop replaying. "Mrs. Carter too?" he asked, his voice even, though the answer had already taken shape in his mind. Harper's mouth tightened as she held the phone, the glow from the screen casting a pale light over her knuckles. She said it was to teach the kids to take care of their things. But her voice thinned, catching slightly before she forced it steady again. He came home shivering. His nose was bright red. "I almost called the principal, but..." She let it fall away, her eyes dropping in that quiet, resigned way of people who have been worn down by too many closed doors and polite deflections. The rain tapped harder now, ticking on the roofs of nearby cars like small fingers drumming, filling the space between their words. People in the lot moved faster, hoods pulled tight, bags clutched close, but the two of them stood inside that narrow circle of stillness, a space that felt private not because it was hidden, but because no one else wanted to linger there. David didn't speak. He kept his eyes on Harper, reading the light brown in them, tired but not yet dulled. The same blend of frustration and helplessness he'd been seeing in his own reflection each morning. "I heard Ben gets sent outside a lot at recess too," Harper continued, her voice dropping lower, as if the cars themselves might carry her words away. "Some of the kids said so. I don't know if it's true, but..." David gave a small, deliberate nod. Sometimes silence is the most certain kind of answer. Harper exhaled, a soft plume of breath vanishing into the damp air almost before it formed. "I don't think I'm the only one who thinks this is wrong." David shifted his weight, one hand tightening on the cart handle. "You're not." That was all, and somehow it was enough. Harper's shoulders loosened a fraction, like the words had landed exactly where she'd hoped. She didn't ask for details, didn't map out a plan, just said, "Thanks, David," before stepping back toward her van. He watched her cross the few steps to a silver minivan, pull open the hatch, and set her bag inside. The air returned to its usual soundtrack, rain on metal, the soft churn of engines pulling away. David stayed where he was a moment longer, letting the wet wind brush over his face, carrying with it the weight of their brief exchange. In his mind, the scattered pieces were shifting into place, not a neat picture yet, but no longer a pile of loose suspicions either. By the time he started walking toward his truck, still gripping the cart handle, he knew one thing for certain. Whatever was happening to Ben wasn't just about Ben, and he wasn't the only one seeing it. Harper had her hand on the driver's side door, about to climb in, then hesitated. The drizzle had darkened the fine hair near her temples, made it cling there. She turned slowly, her eyes holding that measured uncertainty of someone standing with one foot on the last step, testing the drop before they commit. David, still a few paces away, tilted his head slightly, as if tuning his ear to a faint signal in the noise of the lot. Harper slid a hand into her coat pocket, fingers fishing for something, and pulled out a phone in a clear plastic case gone yellow at the edges. A thin crack cut across the top right corner, trailing halfway down the glass, beneath the screen protector. Tiny air bubbles sat trapped like raindrops that couldn't fall. She pressed her thumb to unlock it once, then again when the first touch didn't take, while the screen woke. The air between them filled with small, unremarkable sounds. Rain ticking on the SUV's roof, a trunk latch snapping shut 2 rows over, the muffled bass of a car radio easing past. The phone lit. Harper's finger slid through a roll of everyday images, receipts folded on countertops, grocery bags, a corner of her kitchen table, until she stopped. The photo she opened was washed in the cold light of an overcast noon. She turned the phone toward David. He didn't crowd her, just took a half step closer, close enough for the image to settle in. It was the back lot of the school, a concrete path leading to a long white wooden fence that bordered a patch of grass gone brittle and yellow. At the fence stood a thin boy, his arms crossed tight over his chest, head down, shoulders pulled inward. His jacket was too light for the season, collar up but leaving a strip of windburned skin along his neck. Mud freckles marked the toes of his sneakers, the tips dragging faintly over the ground. David didn't need a caption to know it was Harper's son. Off to the right, beneath the overhang of classroom door, Mrs. Carter stood with 2 other adults, a woman in a small felt hat cupping a paper coffee, a man with a PDA pin on his lapel. The 3 of them leaned slightly toward one another, faces set in easy expressions, half smiles meant for slow conversation. Mrs. Carter's gaze wasn't anywhere near the boy at the fence. Her chin was tilted up, her left hand resting lightly on the other woman's sleeve, the sort of casual contact people use when they're keeping the rhythm of a friendly talk. Harper pinched the image, pulling the boy closer on the screen. Up close, the small details sharpened, his hands gripping his elbows so hard his fingernails pressed deep into the knit of his sweater. The way the wind had flipped a single oak leaf over and over until it smacked the fence and stuck there, the faint droop of his knees inward. The posture of someone trying to make himself less visible. In the corner of the photo, a timestamp, 12:14 p.m., taken last Tuesday, 5 days ago. And for David, looking at it in the rain-slick parking lot, it felt less like a picture and more like a piece of evidence waiting for the rest of the case to arrive. David didn't say a word. He just gave a short nod, the kind of man gives when he's been waiting on a signal and finally sees it. But his eyes changed. The faint reflection of the lot lights in his dark pupils picked up a harder edge, steel without glare, cold but steady like tempered metal. His breathing deepened once before settling, the way a man pulls tight on something inside to keep the whole frame from shaking, locking every joint so nothing rattles loose. Harper pinched the photo back down and swiped to the next one. Same yard, same white fence. Only this time, the boy's head was lifted just enough for his eyes to track the kids chasing an orange ball in the middle of the playground. The distance wasn't much, maybe a few dozen steps, but the look in his eyes stretched like a bridge with no middle span, a reach doomed to stop short. At the far edge of the frame, a metal post with a safe zone sign showed half its height, the red paint peeling in uneven flakes, little curls catching the faint damp. Another mom asked me why I took the picture. Harper said, he could see it. The half-turn, the skeptical eyebrow, the lips pressed thin around the unsaid. Mind your own business. He'd known those faces before, in other contexts, in other uniforms. Different parking lots, same kind of silence. She swiped again. The third photo came up, a tighter shot closer to the knot of adults. Mrs. Carter was smiling, but only with the corner of her mouth. Behind them hung the class bulletin board. Paper maple leaves cut from construction stock, edges curling slightly from humidity. The words "Be kind" written in a careful teacher's hand and taped down with broad strips of packing tape. The slogan floated like a prop from another play. One performed somewhere far from the moment this camera caught. David felt the blood in his body slow, grow heavier. He studied the frame like he was learning a route, every corner, every landmark. The crack in the concrete under the boy's feet, the faint arc where something heavy had been dropped more than once. The dent in the fence where he leaned, worn smooth at elbow height. White paint scraped to thin gray lines by repetition. To anyone else, they were background. To him, they were frequency markers, evidence of a pattern, not an accident. He let his gaze lift from the phone to the fine mist of rain slanting through the light poles. The damp carried that thin plastic smell from the lot, mixing with a faint whiff of coffee escaping someone's paper grocery bag nearby. Off toward the far corner, a man in a ball cap was cinching down the strap on a truck bed. The orange webbing cut across the load at a clean diagonal, pulled tight until it hummed, then snapped once when he gave it a last yank. David thought about the invisible straps in life, the ones that bind a child to the adults who hold authority. If they're kept taut and true, they steady. If they're neglected, they whip loose, lashing whatever soft surface they find. Harper held the phone a few beats longer, like she was giving him time to let the images sink into the walls of his mind where they couldn't be erased. She didn't offer, "Do you want me to send these?" There was no casual exchange of numbers, just one small, deliberate motion, turning the screen slightly toward herself, thumb hovering over the share icon, pausing halfway, as if she knew that asking out loud might weaken the charge of the moment. David nodded again. It was almost imperceptible, more reflex than performance. He didn't want to clutter the air with promises or pin the weight of this into words that might leak later. Instead, he leaned in just enough to pull a handkerchief from his coat pocket and dab away a raindrop that had landed on the edge of Harper's phone. Then he stepped back, not out of courtesy, but because he understood some things need to stay dry and untouched until the time comes to use them. Harper slid the phone back in her pocket, her fingers pressing once against the fabric as if sealing something in. She kept her eyes on him for a long beat, and in the dark mirror of his, she saw something settled, a surface without ripple, without doubt. It was the kind of steadiness that doesn't require the words "I'll take care of it." In the way he stood, in the quiet between their breaths, the answer was already there. The drizzle softened into a clingy mist, the kind that settled on your skin and clothes without you noticing until the chill had already seeped in. The wind shifted, slipping between the rows of parked cars, and both of them turned instinctively, angling their bodies to shield against it. Harper opened the back of her minivan, the hatch lifting with a low hydraulic sigh. She set her paper grocery bag inside with a care that came from habit. David caught the faint rattle of a carton of eggs knocking softly in their slot. He angled his cart toward the return station, the metal frame creaking over small puddles. His head dipped, his shoulders square and level. Not hunched, but carrying something, like a man keeping a new weight under his coat. The pavement held the story of the day in faint, temporary lines, long wet trails from other carts, crisscrossing and fading into the dark gloss of a lot. The lights overhead broke themselves on the puddles, each reflection stretching and blurring like an old strip of film gone soft at the edges. But in David's mind, one image stayed sharp, Harper's photo. Even with his eyes shut, he could see every part of it. The boy folded in on himself by the white fence. The cluster of adults sheltered under the overhang. The Be Kind sign taped hard against the bulletin board as if the tape could make it true. Words about kindness stuck to a wall, while the real thing stood out in the wind, waiting to be let in. He slid the card into its place, the clean clank of metal on metal ringing through the mist. His fingers trembled briefly from the cold, but when he pushed them back into the warmth of his coat pocket, the shake stopped. Not from body heat, but from something clicking into place in his mind. Like a latch sliding into its notch, solid and irreversible. David climbed into the truck, the seat sighing under his weight. One hand gripped the steering wheel, the other rested on his thigh. A bead of water rolled off the brim of his cap, landing on his jeans, spreading into a dark, round bloom. He watched it for a second before turning the key. The engine came alive in a steady hum, the wipers dragging rain into smooth arcs across the windshield. Out at the far end of the lot, Harper's blinker pulsed amber against the dim, her van easing into the thin stream of wet traffic. The dashboard clock flipped over to the next minute, the faint mechanical click louder than it had any right to be. In that second, David felt the last bit of doubt slip out of him. Endurance shifted into action. Watchfulness became aim. His eyes no longer drifted over tile floors or out kitchen windows. They had fixed on a line to follow. That photo wasn't the only thing he had, but it was the first tap on the hardest part of him, the part trained for orders and discipline that now guarded something softer, rarer, but worth the same fight. A boy's right to stand in the middle of the schoolyard without curling himself small against a fence. Once a father sees that taken away, he doesn't turn his head. The coffee shop by the tracks was the kind of place you could miss if you didn't already know it was there. Its old wooden sign swayed gently every time the north wind came through. The painted letters fading, but still legible. David took a table by the window, where the lamplight was warm and the wood beneath his hands bore the scars of years. Rings from mugs, shallow scratches. An old cigarette burned near the corner. The smell of roasted beans wrapped around him, mingling with the cold that seeped in through the seams of his jacket. He'd arrived early. In the service, he'd always arrived early. It gave you time to read a place and the people walking into it. Outside, the station lay still. Every so often a freight train crawled past, its slow grind of steel trailing the heavy scent of oil. David set his phone face down on the table, eyes on the door, but his mind stayed on Harper's images. The boy in the thin coat. Mrs. Carter with her back turned. The distance between them. The doorbell chimed softly. Frank Morales stepped in, tall and broad through the shoulders, his dark blue coat dusted with raindrops. Even without the uniform, he carried himself like a man who'd worn one, movements deliberate, unhurried. His face bore the lines of nights spent chasing deadlines, but his eyes were still sharp. He spotted David, gave a short nod, and pulled out the chair across from him. Been a while? Frank said, dropping a knit cap onto the table. David's mouth shifted into half a smile. Yeah, last time was Mason's funeral. They let the pause sit. Some memories didn't need speaking. 2 black coffees, no sugar. The mugs arrived, steam curling upward in pale ribbons. David flipped his phone over and slid it toward Frank. Take a look at this. One tap brought up the photo. Frank studied it, leaning forward, his brows knitting tighter with each second. Where was this? Ben's school, David said, his voice low. And it's not just him. Harper's kid, same treatment. Frank held the phone a moment longer, then leaned back, folding his arms across his chest. You think this is a pattern? Or just a couple of bad days? David met his gaze steady. I don't buy bad days. Not after what I've seen and what I've heard. He gave Frank the short version. Though even stripped down, it carried enough grit to sink into the wood between them. The recorder in Ben's knit cap. The sound it caught. The muffled edges of other kids' laughter. The quick, sharp beats of a ball bouncing somewhere just out of reach. Ben's voice, small as a loose thread you could snap with 2 fingers, saying, yes, Mom. And then Mrs. Carter's voice, smooth at first, but with a coldness under it, like steel kept in shadow. Frank didn't interrupt. His eyes narrowed, the lines at their corners pulling taut. His fingertips tapped a slow, deliberate rhythm against the arm of his chair, not impatient, but like a man counting seconds before a move. You got the recording? He asked finally. David nodded and slid the phone across. Frank untangled the earbuds, set them in place, and closed his eyes. His broad shoulders rose slightly with his breath as the first sounds came through. When he took the buds out, he exhaled long, not the sigh of someone surprised, but of someone who's seen enough ugliness to recognize it instantly and still feels the sting. If this runs deeper than one teacher, Frank said, voice low, we don't walk away. A train horn outside pulled a single, low note into the room. David turned to watch the red tail lights fade along the tracks before shifting back. I'm not letting Ben turn into one of those names people pass around for a week and then forget. And if there are others, they're coming into the light too. Frank reached into his coat, pulling out a worn leather notebook softened from years of use. He scribbled a few quick lines, then looked up. We'll need more photos, audio, witnesses. You think Harper will talk? I'll ask, David said, but quiet. She's afraid her kid'll pay for it. They worked it out without needing much back and forth. Frank would dig into any past complaints, see what had been buried. David would gather stories from parents, steady and under the radar. Both understood there's no way back once you cross a door that only swings one way. When they stepped outside, the rain had thinned to a fine spray, the kind that shines under the street lamps but disappears when you look straight at it. The pavement was slick and black, reflecting the amber glow in broken shapes. Frank tugged on his cap and gave David's shoulder a light smack. Solid, not for comfort, but to anchor the weight between them. Hold the line, Frank said. You knew how to keep yourself alive over there. Now it's for him. David didn't answer. just watched as his friend's figure shrank into the alley that cut past the station. Later, back inside the cafe, Frank leaned his weight into the chair, the lamplight carving out the worn edges of his face. David pulled a brown envelope from his jacket and set it on the table. Inside, a memory card, printed copies of Harper's photos, and a weathered notebook with a bent corner. Frank opened it, the paper rasping softly. The first sound from the tinny speakers was the wind, steady and tight, like a broom dragged across taut wire. Then the laughter of kids, uneven and punctured by short, sharp calls. Names thrown like pebbles. Frank glanced up, but didn't stop the playback. Mrs. Carter's voice followed, soft in volume, sharp in tone, instructing Ben to sweep the yard. No bite in the words. But no warmth either. They landed with the indifference of a weather report. David slid a photo across the table. A boy hunched against a chain-link fence, shoulders drawn in, hands stuffed deep into his coat. Behind him, Mrs. Carter under the overhang, smiling faintly at two parents. The space between her and the boy was only a few feet, but in the image, it looked like a different world. Frank shut the laptop. His fingers tapped the table, 3 sharp, even clicks like marking the start of something on a clock. "We're gonna write it," he said. No wind-up, no flourish, just the fact of it. David nodded slowly, his gaze drifting to the window. Outside, there were no stars, just the cold spill of street lamps pooling on wet asphalt, shining like the faces of memories you can't wash away. Somewhere in the dark, a slow freight rolled past, the grind of its steel leaving a long hum behind. Frank reached into his bag again, pulling out a black hardcover reporter's notebook. He began jotting. Timestamps, names, fragments of quotes. Each line laid down with deliberate spacing, as if every word needed room to breathe. Across from him, David kept his hands laced, thumbs pressed tight. In his mind, the recording replayed again. The drag of small shoes over gravel, the plastic rustle of a trash bag filling, and that soft, "Yes, ma'am," floating up like breath on a cold day. Gone almost before it's seen, but impossible to forget. They talked it through the way men do when the stakes are real, not loud. Not fast, but deliberate, each suggestion landing with its own weight. Frank leaned forward, elbows resting on the scarred table, his fingers absently drumming near the base of his coffee mug as he mapped it out, talked to other parents, find a few willing to speak on the record, listen to the kids in Ben's class without pushing them, pull the school's disciplinary records, the ones buried in office files and board meeting minutes. David didn't push back on any of it. He only added one thing, non-negotiable. "We keep the kids' names out of it until we know exactly what we're dealing with." His voice was steady, but in the pause afterward, the air between them thickened, both men hearing the truth in that single boundary. You don't put a child in the line of fire unless you're ready to stand there with them. Outside, the rain picked up again, a light percussion against the cafe's tin awning. The sound wove itself between the whistle of a distant train and the occasional hiss of tires on wet asphalt. Frank topped off both mugs from the glass pot on the warmer, the sharp scent of fresh coffee spilling into the space between them. "We're not writing this to stir up a scandal," he said, his tone flat, but carrying that undercurrent David remembered from another life. "We're writing it so they can't keep doing it." David looked up then, meeting Frank's gaze. Those eyes had seen darker ground than any playground, dusty roads overseas, nights lit only by muzzle flashes, but still held a glint. Not the bright, untouchable kind, a smaller, stubborn light. The kind you cup in your hands when the wind's trying to take it. Enough to believe that some fights are worth picking, even if they look small from the outside. They stayed another hour, the cafe slowly emptying around them. Frank opened his laptop, typed a few opening lines, deleted them, then tried again, adjusting the words until they felt balanced, clean. David gave him more of the small details. What Ben wore that day, the sound of his sneakers on gravel. Not to build pity, but so Frank would understand this wasn't just the case. It was a boy who deserved to walk across his schoolyard like anyone else, without looking for the corner where the cold was kept. When they finally stepped out, the rain had softened again. Frank slipped the brown envelope into his backpack, zipping it with the quiet finality of a sealed promise. David pulled his hood up, and together they walked along the slick sidewalk, their reflections stretching and breaking in the puddles under the street lamps. The station fell behind them, but the low groan of steel on rails kept threading through the night, a reminder that time was moving, and that they'd set something in motion they didn't plan to stop. Monday morning slid in under a thin sheet of gray light, the kind that passes for daylight but warms nothing. David woke before the alarm, not from old service habits, but with a taut mix of anticipation and unease sitting in his chest. He brewed coffee, letting the bitter steam fill the small kitchen. The mug was warm in his hands as he sat down at his computer. The independent news site Frank wrote for wasn't the kind that shouted for attention. It was a quiet corner online, where words were still handled like they mattered, where stories got room to breathe. There it was front and center, inside the silent classroom. The headline sat over a black and white photo, a boy at a fence, hands gripping the chain links, head lowered, shoulders tucked in against more than the cold. David scrolled slowly, reading every paragraph. Frank had opened with a scene that might as well have been pulled straight from the recording. Wind threading across an empty yard, laughter tangled with mockery, and that soft, yes, ma'am, you could miss if you weren't really listening. He wrote about a kind of discipline that left no paper trail. No official rule to challenge. Just an unspoken understanding that if you wanted to be left alone, you learned to be quiet about unfairness. The piece let parts of the recording speak for themselves. Printed in italics with no added commentary. Harper's photo appeared midway down, technically in color, but the flat winter light and raindrops on the minivan window made it look like a washed-out painting of loneliness. Further down, Harper's story unfolded. A single mom working nights at the supermarket, not able to be there every minute, finding her son one January afternoon shaking in the cold, lips bluing, while across the yard his teacher stood under cover, laughing with a cluster of parents. David's own quote sat near the end, unpolished, unchanged, when I heard his feet dragging on the gravel. I knew I'd been right to suspect something, but I wished I'd been wrong. Frank didn't close on a call for outrage. Instead, he left the reader with a question. If silence has become the way to survive, what's left of childhood? Below, the comments are already coming in, stories from other towns, other schools, anger wrapped in paragraphs, and some just leaving a single sad emoji like that was all they had. David sat back, his hand still around the mug, the coffee long gone cold. Outside, the town moved slowly. A mail truck slid past, tires whispering on the damp road. He knew one article wouldn't shift the whole ground under them, but it was a sound, clear enough to travel past the classroom walls, across the yard, into places that hadn't heard it before. Before he stood up, David printed the article, folded it, slipped it into an envelope without an address, set it in the desk drawer beside the small black recorder. It would wait there, a piece of a story that wasn't over, but it finally started to find its way out of the silence. The news traveled faster than David ever pictured. Just hours after Inside the Silent Classroom went up, Frank's email inbox started pinging like an alarm clock you couldn't shut off. Messages short and long, some signed, some blank. Many open with "I went through this too," followed by stories almost identical. Different school names, different teachers, different color fences. David's phone lit up too, not with reporters or TV crews, but with parents he'd never met. A mother from the next town over, her voice shaking with anger. They made my son stand in the August sun. He got heat stroke. They gave him 1 cup of water and told him to get back to class. A father sent a photo taken from his office window. Down in the schoolyard, a kid stood far from the shade, arms wrapped tight around himself. One text was just 2 words, "Thank you." No name, no explanation, but David could feel how much was packed inside. An elderly woman from the far end of town sent a handwritten letter in shaky script on yellow paper. "I'm the grandmother of a child at that school. Thank you for speaking when we couldn't." Frank passed along the longer messages, stories with dates, teacher names, even copies of write-up slips. Some had bolded sentences, underlines, and photos attached, small faces bent down, thin coats in the wind. They didn't just back up the article. They showed a whole web of silence that had been there for years. The comments under the story turned into an unexpected forum. Not the arguments David thought he'd see, but people sharing, a parent from another state, a teacher writing anonymously about being told to follow the same orders, a former student remembering the cold winter wall behind the school. Pressure started building. That afternoon, a local radio station invited someone from the school board to respond. At first, they declined. By that evening, a short statement showed up on the board's website. "We acknowledge recent concerns and will review the matter." It was vague, non-committal, but just hearing them say anything at all was already a crack in the wall of silence. David read that statement in the yellow light of his desk lamp, Ben asleep in the next room. He didn't feel victory, just the slow kind of movement that feels like ice thawing. Quiet, but irreversible. Out on the street, the night wind moved through the trees, carrying the smell of wet earth and the first bite of cold in the season. He leaned back in his chair, closed his eyes, listened to the faint hum of the heater, and knew the story wasn't his anymore. It belonged to everyone who had ever suffered in silence. And now, finally, they were starting to speak. That morning, the sky was still hazy, the sun hidden behind a thin layer of clouds that made the whole town look like it had been draped in a sheet of gray. David had just poured his second cup of coffee when his phone buzzed on the kitchen table. He glanced at the screen, a school email. The subject line was short. Official notice from the principal's office. He opened it. The first word that jumped out at him was suspension. The letter was written in that familiar, official tone, starting with an apology for the unfortunate incident and any unintended impact on the student's learning experience. In the middle, he saw Mrs. Carter's name, followed by the line, placed on temporary suspension, pending an internal investigation. Toward the end was a sentence that made him pause. We acknowledge a lapse in oversight and will be reviewing our entire student discipline process. Not a word about Ben. Nothing about standing outside at lunchtime. Nothing about the biting cold. But somewhere between those lines, David could feel the first cracks in a wall that had stood solid for too long. He set the phone down, both hands wrapped around the coffee for warmth. Ben sat beside him, sketching a little sailboat in the corner of a scrap of paper. The boy didn't ask why his dad had gone quiet, and David didn't say a thing. Still, something in his chest loosened, like a rope pulled tight for too long, eased just enough to breathe. Outside, the wind moved through the street trees, carrying the damp smell of earth after rain. When David stepped out onto the porch, he noticed a white envelope tucked under the door. He bent down and picked it up. Inside was a printed copy of an apology letter on school letterhead, with the principal's signature at the bottom. The body of the letter was still formal, careful, but at the very end, in blue ink, was a short handwritten note. I truly am sorry. The handwriting stopped him, not because it erased what had happened, but because it at least admitted it had. He folded the letter and slid it into the drawer by the sink. He knew this wasn't over. Suspension wasn't firing. An apology wasn't change. But it was a step. And in towns like this, sometimes a step is all you can hope for. That afternoon, when David clocked in for a side shift at the auto shop, Tom, the owner, handed him a copy of a local paper. The suspension story was front page, next to an old photo of the school gate. The article listed the allegations, quoted the school board, and closed with, "The incident has drawn wide attention from the community." David folded the paper, set it on the shelf, and kept wiping his hands on a rag. He didn't need to read more. Sometimes the news is just a way for people to say they know, without any promise to change a thing. That night, over dinner, Ben suddenly asked, "Is Mrs. Carter coming back, Dad?" David froze mid-spoon. He didn't want to lie. "I don't know," he said slowly. "But no matter what, you won't be standing outside anymore." Ben nodded and kept eating like that was enough. Later, David stood at the window, watching the streetlights spill across an empty road. In the quiet, he realized not every fight ends in a clean win. Some just end with the weaker ones breathing a little easier, for a while at least. And when he turned off the lights that night, he knew he'd keep watching, because an apology, no matter how heartfelt, only matters if it's followed by action. The silence in the house still hung there, but it was lighter than the night before. The next morning, the sky wore a thin gray veil. Like even the sunlight was hesitating to touch the town. David drove Ben to school in the old pickup. No music, not even a radio. Just the low hum of the heater and the tires rolling over wet pavement, still holding the night's fog. Ben sat in the passenger's seat, leaning back, eyes fixed on the window. The road to school wasn't long, but that morning it felt stretched. The elm trees on both sides had started to turn, leaves falling in patches along the sidewalk. David thought of those early school mornings when Ben would climb in with a brand new backpack, firing off questions about friends and games on the playground. Now the boy was quiet, only pressing his lips together now and then, like holding back something he wasn't ready to let out. When the truck turned onto the narrow street leading to the school gate, David felt his son's hand tighten just a little. He pulled into an open spot near the entrance, but didn't kill the engine right away. They sat there a moment longer. A light breeze chased dry leaves across the concrete yard. The bell hadn't rung yet, but a handful of kids were already scattered around, some running, some standing in small groups talking. Nobody seemed to notice Ben. "You good?" David asked, his voice low, unhurried. Ben gave a small nod without looking back. In that instant, David understood. Sometimes silence is the only way to keep a shred of dignity, especially for a kid who's been left out in the cold, every pair of eyes cutting into him like pins. Ben opened the door, stepped out, his small backpack swaying with his stride. He straightened his posture, adjusted the straps, then turned and gave David a slow, deliberate bow. Not like a kid rushing into class, but like someone closing a chapter. His eyes weren't wet, but there was a far-off look in them that caught David right in the chest. David stayed in the truck. He let Ben have the space to walk in on his own terms. The boy's small frame grew smaller still as he headed for the gate, swallowed up by the crowd. Nobody called his name. Nobody waved. He walked straight ahead, opened the old wooden door one last time, and disappeared inside. David sat there a few more minutes, staring through the windshield where the morning dew was breaking into thin streaks of water. He knew he just watched a farewell, quiet, without flowers or speeches, but heavier than any goodbye he could remember. When Ben came out at noon, the sun had broken through, though it wasn't warm enough to chase off the chill. David parked in the same spot as that morning. The gate opened, and there was Ben, no trace of the exhaustion David had feared. The boy walked quickly toward the truck, steady and sure, like he'd been waiting for this moment all morning. His small hand found David's as soon as he climbed in. The grip was firm enough that David swore he could feel his son's heartbeat through his fingers. He didn't ask a single question. They just sat there, sharing the warmth. The truck rolled away from the gate, tires crunching over a few dry leaves. David glanced over. Ben wasn't looking out the window anymore. His gaze was straight ahead. Maybe, with that old classroom door closed, another one somewhere else had opened. But right now, all that mattered was that hand still resting in his, like a promise that didn't need words. That morning hadn't started with the usual blaring alarm. David had been up early, poured himself a coffee, but only drank a few sips, leaving the rest to go cold on the table. He'd taken extra time getting Ben ready. Not to make sure he looked sharp, but because he knew every small gesture today might make the boy feel safe. The same blue backpack, straps worn at the edges, now had its torn corner stitched and the fabric wiped clean. Inside, David had packed a fresh lunchbox, peanut butter and jelly, cut in half, and a shiny red apple. In the front pocket, he slipped a small handwritten note. "You're doing great. I'm right here." No fancy designs, no doodles, just his slightly slanted handwriting in blue ink. But he knew Ben would recognize it the moment he opened the box. On the way to the new school, the air smelled of damp earth from last night's rain. The quiet street, leading and was broken only by the occasional chirp of sparrows landing on the power lines before darting away. The school sat at the end of the road. Red brick walls weathered with age, white painted eaves, and big windows that let the light flood in. Not loud like the old place. Here it felt calm, like time had learned to move a little slower. When they stepped through the gate, Ben kept his hand locked in his father's. His eyes swept the yard, drifting past clusters of kids, then stopping at the big maple in the middle, its last yellow leaves trembling in the breeze. David bent down, asked quietly, "You okay, kiddo?" Ben didn't answer, just gave a small nod, his grip still firm. The classroom door was already open, the air holding a mix of fresh paper and old wood. The room was smaller than his last one, maybe a dozen desks in 2 neat rows, leaving space down the middle. The walls were lined with kids' drawings, a cat stretched in the sun, a wooden bridge over a creek, a few snowy winter scenes with white roofs and dark windows. The new teacher, a brown-haired woman with her hair tied back, stepped up to greet them. Her voice was soft, not high-pitched, and the way she looked at Ben said, without words, "You're welcome here." She introduced him to the class, but didn't make him stand or speak. She just pointed to an empty desk by the window. "This will be your seat." As they walked over, Ben still held on to David's hand. But his desk mate, a blond boy with messy hair and a green sweater, looked up and smiled. Not forced, not nosy, just enough to say, "I'm glad you're here." Ben hesitated, then gave a small nod back. For the first time that morning, his hand let go. David stood by the door a moment longer, watching his son set his backpack down and take his seat. Ben's eyes went to the trees outside, where a few yellow leaves had just fallen, spinning in the light breeze. In that moment, David felt something in his chest ease. like he'd set down an invisible pack he'd been carrying for too long. He turned and stepped into the hallway. His footsteps blended into the quiet hum of the school. The damp earth smell and the soft sound of leaves brushing together followed him all the way back toward the gate, like a gentle reminder. Some beginnings don't need fireworks or applause, just the right moment to let go, so the person you love can take those first few steps on their own. He lingered in the hall, hands in the pockets of his jacket, holding on to the morning's warmth. This school's hallway was narrower than the old one. Its beige paint faded near the window ledges. Along the wall, rows of low-coat hooks each held a small backpack, some still damp from the rain, some with handwritten name tags. The air carried the scent of old wood, fresh paper, and a faint trace of pencil shavings, something David hadn't smelled in months. Leaning slightly, he peered through the classroom window. Ben sat at the desk by the window, the wooden chair a bit too tall, so his feet swung just above the floor. Morning light spilled through the wide window, laying long gold stripes across the tile, slanting over his desk. It lit a brand-new notebook with a pale blue cover, untouched inside, just clean white pages waiting for something new. David noticed Ben's hands weren't gripping the edge of the desk like in the old classroom. The boy opened the notebook, touched the first page gently like he didn't want to wrinkle it. Every movement was slow, a little cautious, but there was something else too, maybe curiosity, maybe hope. A freshly sharpened pencil lay beside it, the graphite tip catching the sun. The teacher, the same brown-haired woman, passed by his desk. She paused, set a hand lightly on the edge, bent down, and whispered something. Ben looked up, met her eyes. No big smile, just a slow nod, but David knew that was enough. It was her way of saying, "You belong here," without needing to say it out loud. In the hallway, David took a deep breath. He could hear the leaves outside, the faint steps of someone on the wooden floor behind him, the low murmur of kids in class. Each sound fit together like a rhythm, free from tension, free from fear. He leaned against the doorframe, arms loose, feeling the weight he'd carried for months grow just a little lighter. Inside, Ben bent over his notebook again, pencil in hand. The sunlight shifted, the bright stripe across his desk moving like an invisible hand brushing over the page, urging it to be filled. David thought, maybe the first lines Ben writes here won't just be assignments. They'll be the first marks of a new chapter, one untouched by fear, unchoked by the kind of silence that used to keep him small. He didn't walk into the classroom, didn't want to break that moment, just stood there, quiet, like a guard posted over a fragile piece that was just starting to take root. In his eyes, that light spilling over the blank page wasn't just sunlight, it was a promise that from here on, his boy could keep writing his own story with letters that didn't shake. In blank spaces no longer hiding fear. When the bell rang, David finally stepped back from the window. He moved slow down the hall, the sound of his old shoes against the tile coming out solid and steady, like each step was saying, "I'm still here." Close enough for his son to feel, far enough to let him walk on his own. Night settled over the town like a thin blanket, holding the smell of damp wood and a little bit of mist slipping through the roofline. Inside, the kitchen still carried the scent of chicken soup and black pepper. On the stove, the pot sat warm even with the burner off. David washed the dishes without rushing, his hands moving through the same old motions. Rinse, set down, dry, stack. From the living room came the soft scratch of a crayon across paper, quiet, steady, with little pauses. The way leaves outside brush against each other when the wind's just right. Ben sat at the small wooden table by the window, his back bent a little, head tilted into the warm glow of a desk lamp. The crayon box sat open, colors scattered, tips worn down. He traced a black line for an outline, switched to green for the leaves, brown for the trunk, pale yellow for the sunlight falling on the steps. Every now and then he'd stop, pull in a slow breath, let it out through his nose, lips pressed into a thin line. No talking, just the crayon's whisper and the kitchen clock's steady tick. David dried his hands on the dish towel, then leaned on the doorway, staying out of the lamp's circle. From there, he watched the rough lines take shape into something simple. The front of a new school, square windows, a short maple tree on the right, and in front, two figures, one big, one small. The bigger one with broad shoulders, arms hanging loose, head tilted slightly. The smaller one stood closer, hand tucked into the larger hand. Every line was steady, sure. Only the faces were left blank. Just two empty circles, like whatever smile or sadness belonged there would come later. Ben picked up a red crayon and started writing. Big letters, a little uneven, each one with a space between, like the pause between two breaths. Me and Dad. New start. He fixed the word start, adding the missing T, pressing harder so the red was darker there, almost bold. The smell of wax and new paper rose up, mixing with the drywood scent of the table. He set the crayon down, ran his thumb along the paper's edge to flatten it, then lifted it with both hands and carried it over to the big table where David had left the towel. Without a word, he set it down and turned it so David could see. The move was sure but gentle, like he didn't want to scratch the drawing. The whole room seemed to hold its breath in that small space between finishing something and having it seen. David stepped forward, slow, steady. The overhead light caught the wax, so it shone a little. He bent down, both hands resting on the edge of the table, not touching the paper. He studied it, the black outline of the roof, the pale blue windows like they were catching the sky, the yellow streak cutting across the ground, the same morning light he'd seen on his boy's desk earlier that day. On the grass, a few brown and gold dots, fallen maple leaves. The bigger figure stood firm, the smaller leaned just slightly toward it. And that uneven red line of words at the top, clear as day. He didn't say nice job, didn't ask if something good happened at school. Joy, when it shows up, is like a just-boiled egg, too direct a touch, and it cracks. Instead, he put his hand on Ben's shoulder, steady and warm, covering most of it. He held it longer than usual, longer than a clock's tick, long enough for the warmth to sink through the shirt into skin. Ben stayed still, shoulders not pulling in. He shifted his weight from one foot to the other, then stood firm, like a young tree learning where the wind comes from. Outside, the mail truck passed, its low engine rumbling like the street talking to itself. The yellow glow from the streetlight slid across the living room floor, over old scuff marks, the kind left by moving furniture, by years that passed too quick. Inside, father and son stood by the drawing. Neither of them moved much, like they didn't want to disturb the patch of light, sitting just right where it was. David lifted the corner of the paper, just enough to see New Start a little clearer. Down in the bottom left, Ben had penciled in the date, small, slanted, underlined. It made David think of the letters he'd sent from the front years ago. Everyone had a date, like a nail in the wall, keeping the memory from drifting off. He figured maybe tomorrow he'd buy a simple frame, thin glass, lightwood trim, and hang the drawing where they'd see it every day, right above the shoe rack. By the door they passed through every morning. Coming or going, they'd always catch sight of it. Ben edged closer, his fingers resting lightly on the hem of David's shirt. No tug, just a touch. David could hear his boys breathing, steadier than on the nights before, with a longer exhale at the end, like someone who just made it up a hill and found his pace again. David went to the fridge, took a small round magnet shaped like an apple, one of those promo giveaways from years back, and looked at Ben for the okay. Ben nodded. The paper went up on the fridge door, right next to a half-finished shopping list. Milk, laundry detergent, small screws, and a note David had scribbled a few days ago. Porch light bulb, 40W. Among all those everyday odds and ends, the drawing stood out like an open window, pulling the kitchen a little closer to what actually mattered. Then came the usual end-of-day motions. David packed the leftover soup into a container, washed the heavy pot in warm water. Ben folded the used napkins and set them in the cloth basket. Once the kitchen settled, the low rumble of a freight train drifted in from the station, a sound this town carried every night. David switched off the main light, leaving the small lamp on the counter. Its glow pooled on the paper, making the crayon colors lift off the page. Ben went to grab his toothbrush. Before ducking into the bathroom, he glanced back at the drawing. No big grin, just the faintest pull at the corner of his mouth. Then his small footsteps disappeared through the doorway. David sat down at the table, hands resting flat, back straight, eyes on the patch of wall that had just gone dim. He didn't think about tomorrow, didn't plan the next steps, didn't sift through evidence. He just stayed in that moment, where peace wasn't some far-off thing, but something you could see, touch, a paper with two figures standing in front of New School. A minute later, Ben came back, hair damp on his forehead from a splash of water. He stood behind David, then stepped around to his side. David leaned a little to make room. They didn't hug, just stood close enough for David's hand to land on his son's shoulder again, longer than usual. In his other hand, he held out a small towel. Ben took it and wiped a thin line of water from his chin. A quiet exchange, no words, but it carried weight. When bedtime came, Ben headed toward his room, pausing at the doorway to glance at the drawing one more time. David followed, flicking off another switch. Darkness stretched thin from the living room to the hallway, but the fridge still had its light, so every time the door opened, the drawing would shine again. He told himself he'd cover it with a thin sheet of plastic tomorrow to keep it from smudging, then frame it over the weekend. He also knew there'd be more phone calls, more letters, more cold meetings with the system. But here in the quiet of the house, with the smell of wood and crayon wax that all stayed at the edges, benched or clicked shut, David lingered in the hallway, letting his eyes adjust. He heard the soft creak of the bed, the faint rustle of a blanket, then nothing. Outside, the wind brushed against the porch, carrying the smell of wet leaves. He walked back to the kitchen, looked at the drawing again. The red words, me and Dad. New Start still had a slight shine to them, the start pressed darker, like an unplanned emphasis. He set his fingertips against the fridge, feeling the cold through his skin. Then he pulled his hand back and switched off the counter lamp. The kitchen eased into a gentle dark, with only a thin band of streetlight cutting across the fridge door, splitting the paper into two halves, what's past and what's coming. David touched his own shoulder, still feeling the echo of that earlier grip. And in that small, steady quiet, he understood, sometimes the vows worth keeping don't need to be spoken. They live in the way a father keeps his hand on his boy's shoulder, just long enough for two heartbeats to slow into the same rhythm. Evening settled over the block like a thin blanket, laying a honey-colored light across the little neighborhood. Out on the porch, David sat in an old wooden chair, a sweater hanging loose over his shoulders, listening to the wind work its way through the maple trees out front. Ben sat beside him, his legs swinging just enough to tap the chair, hands wrapped around a mug of hot cocoa David had just made. The steam curled up and tangled with the faint smoke drifting from the kitchen, blending into that warm, early winter smell, cocoa, dry wood, and a trace of toasted bread still lingering in the air. Light from the living room spilled through the glass door, resting on their shoulders like it had all the time in the world. Inside, the dinner table was still set, 2 plates, a basket of torn bread, and a drawing Ben had made the afternoon before, pinned neatly to the fridge. Just a few rough pencil lines, but now it felt like a quiet promise that from here on, things would be different. David watched his boy without a word. Ben was telling some story, voice low and slow, but not guarded the way it used to be. Every short laugh he let out felt like a pebble dropped into a still pond, ripples reaching out in gentle rings. David didn't interrupt, just leaned in close enough to catch every word, as if afraid that breaking the moment would scare it off. Outside, the streetlights came on one by one, pulling a thin wash of light down the quiet road. Somewhere in the back of David's mind, the words came, words he knew he'd never forget. Silence is never innocent. Sometimes, love means breaking it. He didn't think it was just for him or for Ben. It felt like it belonged to anyone who's ever had to choose between keeping quiet or speaking up. Silence can be a shield, but sometimes it's just a wall keeping people who need each other apart. The wind caught the porch curtain and gave it a gentle sway. From deep inside the house, the wall clock kept a steady beat, joined by the faint sound of footsteps from across the street. No one was rushing, no one was calling out, and there were no more whispered words to make Ben lower his head. Just the two of them, the wooden porch, and the stretch of dark sky they could look at together. David leaned over and set a hand on his son's shoulder. Ben rested against him easily, like the space between them had never been there. David knew there was still work ahead. Trust to rebuild, habits to relearn, mornings without the dread of sending his boy into a place he couldn't protect him. But for tonight they could sit here, listen to the wind on the porch, and know they'd started down a new road. The door behind them closed softly, not to shut them in, but to keep the warmth inside. The yellow lamp in the living room cast a soft strip of light across the porch floor, just brushing Ben's feet. In the yard, a neighbor's cat slipped by, its shadow disappearing into the dark. Everything stilled for a moment, like the whole world had paused to give this bit of time to the two of them, sitting there on the old porch in late fall. No cheating crowds, no fireworks, just the kind of peace David knew he'd carry the rest of his life. And somewhere outside the frame, a voice rose, gentle but firm. Silence is never innocent. Sometimes, love means breaking it. The door clicked shut. The quiet stayed, like a photograph no one dared to disturb. Some stories don't end with applause or bright lights, but with a long, steady breath. This was one of them. David and Ben hadn't won any grand battle. They'd simply reclaimed what everyone should have, a sense of safety and the right to speak. On the porch that first cool night, the lamp inside threw a halo around them. No one said a thing. No one needed to. In life, some silences are like an embrace. Others swallow the truth whole. And once you see the difference, sometimes love is finding the courage to break that silence. If you've ever lived through or witnessed a silence that wasn't fair, I'd like to hear your story. Not to judge, but so we can believe, together, that when we speak up, the world becomes safer for the small hands that count on us.